Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 2, and in this we are going to look at the second half of the perspectives on justice. So as you are well aware, these two lectures are dedicated to summarizing the 6 justice perspectives. In Lecture 1, that we looked at the crime control, rehabilitation, and due process perspectives, and in this lecture we are going to look at the non-interventionist, equal justice, and restorative justice perspectives. Just as a reminder again that we're going to be applying these concepts in this week's discussion. So let's go ahead and get started. The first perspective we're going to be covering in this lecture is the non-intervention perspective. So the main focus of the non-intervention perspective is to minimize contact with the criminal justice system. And the reason that this perspective wants to minimize contact that individuals have with the criminal justice system is because they argue that much of the interaction with the criminal justice system causes harm, and oftentimes the harm that interaction has is actually more harmful than the offense itself. So take for an example, interaction with police at traffic stops, okay? As we know, a method that police use in high crime areas is to pull over drivers for minor offenses like failure to use the turn signal or the tag, your registration tag being out of date. And as we've recently seen, and we've seen over the last several years, that oftentimes that interaction that the driver has with law enforcement can become very violent and sometimes deadly. Take, for example, somebody who's charged with a misdemeanor for stealing personal property. That person charged with that crime, then bail is set. They're unable to make bail, and so they sit in county jail waiting for the next court procedure, and in the meantime they might lose their job, they might lose their apartment, and in fact being in prison, the jail itself can have a harmful effect. And so the non-interventionist perspective is basically saying that you want to minimize this contact. And they see it as being harmful because it leads to the stigmatizing and labeling of those who have interaction with the criminal justice system. You think about getting pulled over by the cops and then getting handcuffed, and the stigma that comes with that, the stigma with being in jail for a charge that maybe you weren't even responsible for, but of the stigma of not being able to show up for your job, and then the labeling that comes with that too, being labeled as offender. Okay, that it's harmful because that it can disrupt family and community. That if you're having lots of interaction with the criminal justice system in your neighborhood, in your community, that you're treated like a criminal, then you become a criminal. And that when you're institutionalized, even if that institutionalization, incarceration is justified, right, and it's following the law, that there are profound effects on that institutionalization in terms of the effects it has obviously on the family and the community, but also the impact that it has on the individual and the difficulty that individual has in terms of coming back into society. And so from the non-interventionist perspective, that all these types of harmful effects that people experience with the interaction with the criminal justice system can contribute to crime commission. You get labeled as a criminal, you act like a criminal. Your family is disrupted because one of your family members is incarcerated, and therefore the family is frayed, and the children in the family don't get the proper supervision. So for the non-interventionist perspective, what should be the focus and the goal of the criminal justice system? Well, for the non-interventionist perspective, they place emphasis on a certain type of crime. They think that the criminal justice system should focus on the most violent offenses. So you should keep in mind, the non-interventionist perspective is not like the anarchy perspective. It's not saying that there should be no laws and that there should be no law enforcement. What they're saying is that the criminal justice system should focus on those crimes that do the most harm to people, and that they should then, for those kinds of crimes that don't do as much harm or very minimal harm to society, that for one, they should be decriminalized. So the non-interventionist perspective says that nonviolent victimless crimes such as drug possession, drug distribution, prostitution, gambling, pornography, that they don't see that there is harm that comes from that. They don't see that there, or at least not a lot of harm that comes from that. They don't see that there are clear victims of that, although, I mean, clearly, I think that one could argue about this perspective. But they really think that those kinds of offenses should be decriminalized. And for nonviolent offenses, they really feel that there should be alternatives to incarceration, since institutionalization within the criminal justice system can really have the harmful effects like we talked about on the last slide. And so they would be in support of electronic monitoring at home, potentially work release programs, and other sort of like allowing the sentencing somebody but deferring that sentence, as long as people get treatment, etc., to keep them out of the institutions of the criminal justice system. That's what they place emphasis on with this perspective. This brings us to perspective 5, the equal justice perspective. So as the title of this perspective suggests, its main focus is ensuring that all people receive the same treatment under the law, equal justice. And so that, in a way, there's some dovetailing or connections between the equal justice perspective and the due process perspective. With the due process perspective, it says that the state should follow the fair procedures that are set out, and that all who are accused of crimes should be equally afforded those same sorts of protections. And the equal justice perspective is also concerned with this equal treatment under the law. They're concerned about this because they think that people commit crimes in part, that there are many reasons for why people commit crimes, but unequal justice, it can be a driver in terms of crime commission. Kind of similar to the due process perspective, the equal justice perspective says that when people are treated equally but unequally by the criminal justice system, it can really result in frustration. That frustration with the criminal justice system can aid recidivism. That is, that you're going to be a repeat offender because you feel like the rules don't apply, that some people are treated one way, other offenders are treated another way, right? And so that if there's that injustice within the criminal justice system, then it kind of transfers over into just the general attitudes towards society, and that there's a lack of trust. You don't know what to expect from the criminal justice system, right? That some people are treated harshly, others treated very lightly, and that can have a sense that there's bias within the criminal justice system, which leads to a lack of trust. And so you can just think of a couple of examples, right? I mean, there are many examples where people commit the same crime, but that there's leeway in terms of the sentence they may receive. One person may receive probation, another person may receive 3 years incarceration. That you could kind of say, hey, if you both engaged in aggravated assault, why should one person get probation and the other person gets a stiffer a sentence of incarceration? Even when you're incarcerated, that sometimes people might be sentenced to 7 years, but they'll get out for good behavior, they'll get out early on parole, while others, under the same circumstances, they never make parole and they have to serve their full sentence. And so all of that is something that the equal justice perspective is concerned with. So the equal justice perspective places emphasis on equal treatment of offenders, right? Or potential, or those accused of offending. And so they focus on that people should be treated the same regardless of their class, their race, their gender, or their age, okay? And so, in other words, that it doesn't matter whether the offender is rich or poor, but that they should, be sentenced according to their the harmfulness of their crime, not because of their economic abilities. That white and black folks should be treated equally. That we should be very mindful of racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. Applies to gender and to age as well. If you'll read in your textbook that the equal justice perspective is really concerned about this concept called the racial animus model. And what the racial animus model is that it's a theory that in the United States, that when we think about and when we have a mental image of who the typical offender is, who comes to mind, the mental image that comes to mind is a young African American male, no remorse, and as such should get the harshest punishment possible. And there are actually studies that we're going to be watching the documentary The 13th, which really focuses on the racial animus model and the role that it played in the war on drugs in the United States. And I used to teach the book called The New Jim Crow, Colorblindness in the Age of Mass Incarceration by Michelle Alexander. And you'll see her in the movie The 13th. And in that book, she talks about how when you ask people to close their eyes and imagine a criminal offender in the United States, they're both black and white folks, that's the image that they come up with. And so knowing that, the equal justice perspective wants to take that in mind and be very mindful of racial bias within the criminal justice system. Now, you could say that maybe there are times when offenders should be treated differently, right? When you think about age, I think that at least prior to adulthood, it would make sense to treat younger offenders differently than older offenders, because cognitively, younger offenders are not like cooked up, right? That their impulse control areas of their brain are not fully developed. And there's some aspects of class that is, if you have the money and you can buy a good defense team, I mean, I guess you could put limitations on that, but that would, go against some of our, perspectives regarding, individual rights. That being said, that to counterbalance that, you could make sure that taxpayer dollars are really paid, go towards public defenders, so that those who are poorer get a very good defense. Right now, public defenders, as we're going to see in a documentary we're going to watch later in the semester, are really underpaid. The equal justice perspective also places emphasis on truth in sentencing. Okay. And so if it's the same offense, you should get the same sentence. And that the state of Wisconsin has truth in sentencing. We have many states have guidelines that are, guide the sentencing recommendations for offenders, and so that you got more uniformity in that. And that also that truth in sentencing is in Wisconsin, that if you are sentenced to 10 years, you're going to serve 85% of your 10-year sentence, and that applies to all of the convicted. Okay, therefore, sort of taking out of the component the time off for good behavior, because there can be bias that comes into play there. On the flip side of that, though, you probably want an incentive for people when they're incarcerated to behave, right? And so maybe some of that flexibility is needed. And then that finally, that the punishment should be based on the present crime. It shouldn't be based on what you've done in the past. It shouldn't be based on what you're going to do in the future. Okay, and from that perspective, you're more likely to get equal treatment within the criminal justice system. Again, we can see some problems with this potentially. That if you are a repeat offender, right, it seems reasonable to think that you might want to take that into consideration, because the probability of you offending again is higher because you seem to have a pattern of offense. But this is sort of in a nutshell the equal justice perspective. This brings us to our sixth and final perspective, the restorative justice perspective. The main focus of the restorative justice perspective is to create a just and peaceful society. In other words, what the restorative justice perspective focuses on is restoring justice. That this perspective knows that crime hurts people, it's harmful, and that you want to repair the breach, right? You want to take the work and do the work necessary in order to make sure that the society is sort of repaired or restored after a crime, and also that the victim is repaired and restored after the crime as much as possible, and that also the offender understands the harm that they perpetrated, that they caused on society. Now, on one hand, a restorative justice perspective seems like the kumbaya, like criminal justice perspective, like, oh, let's just all get in a circle and hold hands and forgive each other, and then we can go on our merry way. That is not what the restorative justice perspective is about. Restorative justice perspective is about doing the hard work for the community to repair, to hold offenders accountable, and the hard work associated with offenders recognizing the harm that they've done, and also the hard work that it takes for a victim of crime to actually meet face to face with their offender and basically try to forgive them if possible. From a restorative justice perspective, that when they ask why do people commit crime, again, there are many reasons for why people commit crime. But from the restorative justice perspective, they think that one of the more important reasons for why people commit crime is that they fail to understand the harm that their crime has caused people. That in many ways that, when we deal with criminal harm, that oftentimes the perpetrator never meets the victim. Oftentimes that it is an institution that is meting out justice, the criminal justice institution, right? The judge, a courtroom, the offender can be abstracted from the harm. They never see the harm that they do oftentimes. They don't see that when you killed somebody, this is the impact it had on the family. When you assaulted somebody, this is the impact that it had on their body, their ability to do their job, and the ability to parent, right? That offenders are often disconnected from the harm that they do. And the restorative justice perspective wants to address that. As it says there, that when a conflict takes place, when there is harm on the community, that the resolution of this conflict, the resolution of this harm should take place in the community, not abstractly by the punitive state, not abstractly by the criminal justice system. Now, they're not saying the criminal justice system should be involved at all, but they're saying that the community should be brought into this process of repairing the harm. So, from a restorative justice perspective, what's the best way to prevent crime? Well, from this perspective, that the best way to prevent crime, or one way to prevent crime, is for the victim to actually confront the offender, at least for the victim to have an opportunity to confront the offender. They don't have to, it's their choice. But that a lot of times victims, say that they want to feel safe. They want to understand why this person committed this crime. They want to see this person as a human, and they want to hold them accountable for it, and see whether or not the offender gets an opportunity to understand the harm that they've done. And so the best way to prevent a crime is for the victim to confront the offender if they so choose, and then for the offender to actually see the harm caused by the crime. Because if you actually see the harm, the theory is if you actually see the harm that you've done, whether that's minor harm like property damage of somebody's garage. I live in River West. The number of years we've lived here, our garage door has been graffitied. I can't tell you how many times. If we don't get the graffiti off of our garage, we get a citation, right? And so, it's not a big deal, but, there's a lot of times where I wouldn't mind if the graffitier came over to my house and painted over my garage, right? Because if they don't do it, we're going to do it, and it's a pain in the ass. It's kind of a simple example. But that, could be the harm of robbing somebody's store, and the impact that had on their business, and even as difficult as confronting and knowing when you've committed a violent offense, the impact that has had on the family and the community. They also, think that if people know about the harm caused, they might think twice about committing crimes in the future. And also it gives the offender an opportunity to actually participate in restoring the harm, right? That they make amends, that they could repair the damaged garage, they could come and work in the store and with their labor in order to pay the community back. And that because of this, it might make you be able to integrate back into the community, because it showed that you actually cared about the community and you were willing to do the work necessary to repair. Now, clearly not all offenders are capable of doing this. Clearly not all victims are willing to participate in this. But this is sort of the ideal that the restorative justice perspective is shooting for, that they want the punishment linked to repairing the harm, making amends, opportunities to integrate. Now, let's keep it real. It's a lot easier to pursue restorative justice with nonviolent crimes, okay? Property damage, theft, and those sorts of things. However, the restorative justice perspective is being used for violent crimes. And the article that you're going to be reading this week, and you're going to look at it, it's 28 pages long. You're going to be like, what? It's too long. Okay. There are pictures in it. It's from The Atlantic. Great pictures of the family that have been impacted by nonviolent crime. When you're reading it, it's a lot of you in your self-introductions were talking about how you really like learning about crime. And this is that kind of article, right? It really brings you into the life of these people who lost their mother to murder, and the family's efforts to engage in the restorative justice process with the murderer. But you're also going to see that there are limits of using restorative justice in violent crimes. And so make sure you read that. It really shows the limits and the benefits of the restorative justice perspective in action. Plus, there are 2 questions on the quiz, the reading quiz this week. So make sure that you actually read the article, because then you will do better on the quiz. So as I mentioned earlier, that your online discussion this week is giving you an opportunity to apply the concepts that you're learning in the chapter and the lectures. So the discussion this week gives you an opportunity to apply the concepts. So when you go to the discussion, you'll see that in that there's a link that you click on, and it'll have your name, and you'll be assigned a particular perspective. So non-interventionist, equal justice, what have you. Okay. So you'll be assigned a perspective, and then you in the discussion, you're going to say, like, what do you think that this perspective gets right? Where does it fall short? What does it get wrong? Okay. And then you explain how 2 of the following would do its job if it were governed by your perspective. Okay. And so that we have the police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, correctional agents. Okay. So these are the agents that work within the criminal justice system. And so in the discussion, what you're going to do is, let's say that you get crime control is your perspective. Okay. Well, then you would tell me that how police would do their job if they were governed by the crime control perspective. And then maybe you would tell me how the judges would do their job if they were governed by the crime control perspective. Okay. And so that is what that's the discussion. You'll also be given an opportunity of which of the 6 comes closest to your own perspective. Then you'll look at what other students have done after they post, and then you can offer corrections on where, what you thought they might have gotten wrong in terms of applying their concepts. Be nice, right? But we're kind of learning from each other. And then react to what a perspective they think comes closest to your own personal perspective. Okay? All right. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate your time and attention, and I'll talk to you again soon.